Joined now by international relations expert Ayesha Kajee for some analysis. Ayesha, good to have you, and thank you very much for coming on. The assassination attempt against Trump, is this a surprise to you, having, of course, listened to some of the rhetoric on this campaign and the tone that this rhetoric has taken, particularly leaning towards more of a violent side?
I think we've seen an increase in political violence in the United States for the last few years. And, you know, the most significant perhaps before this incident being the January 2021 protests, you know, at the Capitol in Washington. And this incident, the shooting at Mr. Trump, certainly it was shocking. Certainly it indicates that there is perhaps increasing support in the United States for this type of political violence. A survey done just last month by the University of Chicago actually shows that on both sides of the political spectrum, both the right and the left, that there is increasing support for political violence, and indeed that while previously there was more support for violence against Mr. Trump and his type of politics, that has now come full circle, and indeed now about 26 million people support violence against Mr. Trump, compared with about 18 million people who support violence in favor of Mr. Trump. But certainly both Mr. Trump's rhetoric and the rhetoric of certain other leaders in the United States has been concerning, because it seems to indicate a support for violence and a lack of respect for the values of democracy and good governance. But that's not only about the political climate in the U.S. It's also about the free availability of weapons in the U.S., the so-called right to carry arms in many American states, etc., and an increase in gun violence generally, which we've seen in incidents such as, you know, so-called terror incidents, school shootings, etc. I think the level of tolerance for violence in American society has risen, and perhaps in Western society as a whole.
Yeah.
And concomitant with that, we've seen increasing support for political violence, as well as rhetoric, that appears to promote violence on both sides of the electoral divide.
Yeah, they've both now come out.
Added to that, you've also... go ahead.
I'm saying they've both now come out to try and make speeches that are dialing down the rhetoric to kind of call for unity. How is that likely going to play out?
I think it's good that they've both come out, both Mr. Biden and Mr. Trump have come out in condemnation of this kind of political violence, as well as former President Barack Obama has also made strong statements in this respect. But once a leader does tacitly appear to encourage violence, and his or her supporters take up that cause, it's difficult then to dial it down when something like this happens. And as I was saying, there's firstly, as I said, an increase in violence in American society more generally, especially gun violence. There's also an increase of tolerance for political violence. And then you also have the political system itself in the U.S. It's the world's so-called largest democracy, where you've got a very bipartisan system that does appear to exclude many people from active participation in democracy at a level where they have the ability and the power to make meaningful change through electoral democracy. Many people have become very dissatisfied, disenchanted with that in the United States and indeed across many Western democracies.
Yeah, indeed. So you've got then, as you put it, these calls for unity, but they are going to happen in the midst of accusations and blame as well. Is that likely going to reset the polarization, or is that going to make the polarization even worse, which will then, I suppose, continue to define what is U.S. politics?
Well, I think it really, really depends on how political leaders deal with this, not only in making statements condemning this last round of violence, but also whether, again, on both sides of the political divide, whether leaders actually attempt to combat misinformation, so-called fake news, etc. We've seen, particularly during the Trump presidency, but even during the Biden presidency, we've seen that the establishment, if you will, has tacitly condoned certain types of misinformation. And as long as that kind of misinformation becomes acceptable in mainstream media and more particularly on social media, where people organize using this kind of rhetoric, as long as that remains the status quo and there isn't outright condemnation of widespread misinformation, whether that it plays into certain political elements or not, we need to see a real push to combat so-called fake news, which is not really a thing. Misinformation is what I prefer to call it. And when it's deliberate, then disinformation, sorry.
Yeah.
And we've seen this kind of disinformation used particularly for political purposes. It's got to stop, because if it doesn't, and if tacitly it continues to be accepted, then you get all kinds of conspiracy theories entering, into first the deep web, and then on normal social media channels, closed ones such as WhatsApp, Reddit, Telegram, etc. And once you have that, it becomes very easy for people to then whip up political sentiment against one leader or the other through using these conspiracy theories, through using the misinformation and disinformation, for propaganda purposes, really.
Yeah. Some analysts have said this would be quite a decisive moment in the sense that either it will justify the restoration of Trump to the presidency, or it will justify preventing Trump from becoming president. How do you think that that X will fall?
I think it's a difficult one to predict right now. I think that Mr. Trump's star is in the ascendant again, particularly because the traditional political left in the US is so divided. And one of the reasons, or one of the issues upon which the left has become extremely polarized within itself has been the issue of Palestine, and particularly the ongoing attacks in Gaza, the genocide in Gaza. And that has really divided the left to the extent that it is quite possible that this attack on Mr. Trump can be used again for political capital, and be used to actually endorse his rise back to the White House. So while it's a very difficult one to call, I think a lot depends on how the political spin doctors on both sides of the divide will spin this issue, whether they will leverage it to actually catapult Mr. Trump back to the White House, or whether the Biden administration can find some leverage to prevent that from happening. As I said, the University of Chicago study that I referenced earlier, shows that support for political violence against Mr. Trump is now higher than support for political violence for Mr. Trump.
Yeah.
But on both sides, that's a concern that political violence is actually gaining traction in the US, whether it be anti-Trump or anti-Biden. It is still a matter for grave concern. It should unite the House of Representatives and Congress so that we actually see a condemnation across the board, rather than attempts to use political violence or sentiments endorsing political violence within the political framework in the United States.
Of course, you speak about the spin doctoring, the iconic shot of Trump standing with his fist in the air, blood coming down from the side of his head. The strategists are using that as a perfect moment to, I guess, get those who sympathize with him to rally around him, but even those who don't necessarily do so. But I suppose as I'm saying this, should not lead us to forget that he also was involved to an extent in the violent narrative.
Absolutely, particularly, as I said, the really key moment when it became evident that violence endorsed by senior political leaders could have really dire consequences was, of course, the January 6th, 2021 protests, the storming, if you will, of the U.S. Capitol, which was unprecedented in American politics prior to that, and the levels of violence we saw there. And also the fact that the study I referenced earlier shows that those who support violence in the domestic polity in the U.S. are predominantly urban Americans. We tend to think of urbanites as being more sophisticated, perhaps better educated, more in touch with, the pulse of global politics, etc. So it's actually a surprising finding that most of those who support political violence are not so-called, rednecks or people living out in the boonies, but actually city dwellers on the whole.
Would it be wise, I suppose, at this particular point, as many are predicting will happen because of just Biden's disposition and his religious beliefs, that he's likely going to tone down on communication that is critical of Trump, at least in the next 48 hours, out of respect? Is that going to work against him?
I think he will do it out of respect. I do think that, to some extent, extreme religiosity of both candidates, both Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden, can play into this kind of political violence rhetoric. At the same time, that extreme religiosity can also be a serious drawback in electioneering. So I think Mr. Biden will tone down the rhetoric, and whether that will work in his favor or actually add to Mr. Trump's perhaps, that heroic kind of figure, as you said, with the sort of media spin around that with blood streaming down his temple, etc., remains to be seen. I think it's too early to call right now.
Ayesha, appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on. Ayesha Kajee, international relations expert there for us.